Today we're in 1 Timothy chapter 1. We just began a study in 1 Timothy last time we were together. And so we're going to pick up at verse 5 here in 1 Timothy chapter 1. And we're going to continue to verse 11 today. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. And in this passage, the Apostle Paul is giving to us insight concerning the purpose of the law. And so we'll be looking at that as we go through our study this morning. 1 Timothy chapter 1, beginning at verse 5. 1 Timothy chapter 1, beginning at verse 5, reading to verse 11. Paul writes, "Now the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith, from which some, having strayed, have turned aside to idle talk. From which some, having strayed, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor the things which they affirm. But we know that the law is good, if one uses it lawfully, knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for the lawless and insubordinate, for the ungodly and for sinners, for the unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for fornicators, for sodomites, for kidnappers, for liars, for perjurers, and if there is any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine, according to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which was committed to my trust." So we're going to have a good time today. I want you to note as we begin here how Paul says the purpose of the commandment is love. Paul is instructing in 1 Timothy a young pastor and a young man by the name of Timothy. And he's giving him instruction concerning leading a church. One of the things that Paul has to deal with, and he does so from the very beginning, is he has to deal with the fact that infiltrators are entering into the church and are bringing bad doctrine. Very early in the history of the Christian church, false teachers began to infiltrate. And because that's true, you find warnings throughout the New Testament concerning that. There's a call to believers to be on the alert. And Jesus began that in his own ministry. On one occasion, it's recorded in Luke chapter 21, verse 8, Jesus said, "Take heed that you not be deceived. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and the time has drawn near. Therefore, do not go after them." So very early in the ministry of Jesus Christ and into the history of the church, warnings were given concerning infiltrators, false teachers who would enter in. The Apostle Peter writes to us in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, and he says, "There will be false teachers among you who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, and bring on themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their destructive ways, because of whom the way of truth will be blasphemed." When Paul was writing to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 13 through 15, he spoke of false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. No wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works. John in 1 John 4:1 said, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." And so, from the beginning, when Jesus was teaching into the ministry of the apostles and all, you find warnings concerning false teachers who will infiltrate churches. This particular church here that is addressed in 1 Timothy is a church that existed in the city of Ephesus. And in that city of Ephesus, there were some great teachers and leaders that church history has recorded. For example, Apollos was there as a teacher. You have the Apostle Paul. You have a teacher by the name of Aquila. Church tradition holds that the Apostle John also went to Ephesus. It was a wonderfully taught church. It was a church that was ministered to by the Apostle Paul and various others, and was taught in a wonderful way. And yet, 3 years before 1 Timothy was written, the Apostle Paul had a meeting with the elders of the church. It's recorded in the book of Acts in chapter 20. And it's in verses 29 and 30. And he says there, "I know this, that after my departure savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock Also, from among yourselves men will rise up speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after themselves. So Paul said from the very beginning you'd have outside and inside attacks. Outsiders will come in, and even internally you'll have people who are drawn away. And we see that. We see in 1 Timothy that in chapter 1, verse 20, he even mentions two of the names of people who are spreading false doctrine within the church. In verse 20 here in chapter 1, he says, of whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I delivered to Satan, that they learn not to blaspheme. And so even within this church, a church that had been warned, the elders had been warned 3 years before the letter was written, that there would be false doctrine and false teachers. Even after that warning, even after Jesus had already warned in his messages and others had gone on to communicate the same thing, Paul has to write and has to tell Timothy, be careful. So he's writing Timothy to encourage him to remain faithful to what he has received. And as a young pastor, he must faithfully teach God's Word and he must safeguard it. I want you to see one of the last things he says. It's found in chapter 6 here, 1 Timothy chapter 6. I want you to see what he says to Timothy even as he's closing this letter. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 20, O Timothy, guard what was committed to your trust, avoiding the profane and vain babblings and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. Hang on to it and guard it, safeguard it, defend it, present it, because it's the truth of God. And you need to hold fast to those things. So what you need to do is you need to make sure that truth is taught and that error is exposed and refuted. And also, Timothy, you need to use your authority to silence false teachers as well as rebuking them. And so that's what Paul is talking about here in 1 Timothy chapter 1. He's speaking concerning a commandment that he's given to him because these teachers are bringing in false things. Now, what is it that they're teaching? Well, in verse 4 it says, nor give heed to fables and endless genealogies. What they're teaching is legends and stories manufactured by men. Paul speaks of it as being blasphemous. And later on in chapter 4 we're going to be seeing that it teaches a kind of asceticism. And later on in 2 Timothy he went on to say there was a denial of the resurrection. Paul refers to these kinds of doctrines as doctrines of demons. Now, as they're speaking here, and he speaks concerning the fact that they teach concerning notice verse 4, fables and endless genealogies. By referring to their family lines, they may be attempting to gain some prestige through family members who at one time had lived and actually had a great reputation amongst the people. Sometimes people will think of themselves as being valuable, actually have a borrowed status because they are related to somebody who was famous. And so a lot of times what we try to do is we can try to make it appear as if we are, by being in association with them, that we ourselves have great value. And we can do that. And that's what these people were doing. They were giving endless genealogies, trying to point back that they may have been related to a Moses or a Joshua, a Gideon, or some great member of Jewish history and all. And people like to do that. They like to associate with famous people. I read recently of a family historian who was writing his family history, and he was dismayed to find out that he had an ancestor who had been publicly hanged. And he's writing this thing, and he wants people to see him in a good light. Now he discovers that one of his ancestors was publicly hanged, and so he's trying to figure out how he can write that without looking bad. So in a moment of inspiration, he wrote, he died during a public ceremony when the platform upon which he was standing collapsed beneath him. And so we can do that kind of thing. We try and associate with people who have great reputations and also that we might borrow from them. And then we discover that maybe we're related to somebody who wasn't quite that good. We find a way to get around that. So Paul is here writing, and he's speaking concerning these things. And so in verse 5 he says, the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith. In contrast to these false teachers, Paul makes it clear that his command that he's giving has a purpose. And the purpose of the commandment is to develop a group of believers who are in love with God and love people. That's the purpose of the command. The purpose of the commandment is love. I was reading recently that a pastor was saying that we should apologize as Christians to the world because we're irrelevant. And I was thinking about that. We should apologize because the church is irrelevant. And I thought, I just can't see that. I don't believe that at all. The Bible makes it very clear that we as believers are salt and we are light. that we have a purpose, and the purpose is to love God and love people. So why would I, as a pastor, apologize to the world for being what they perceive to be irrelevant? And yet there are a lot of people who think that the church is irrelevant, and it's not.